Have you ever inherited something that feels wrong? Not just a house or a piece of land, but something ancient, something dark? Adrian Thorne had no idea what awaited him when he received the letter, an inheritance from a distant relative he never knew existed. The house, isolated and forgotten in the depths of the English countryside, should have been a blessing for a man on the verge of losing everything. But from the moment he stepped through its doors, an unsettling feeling crawled under his skin. The air inside was heavy, thick with dust and the smell of decay, as if the walls themselves were rotting from secrets they held too long. And those secrets, they were watching him. As night fell on his first evening there, Adrian noticed things he couldn't explain. Subtle movements in the corners of his eyes, distant whispers that seemed to echo through the long-abandoned halls. He brushed it off as his mind playing tricks, the stress of his recent job loss, and the isolation weighing heavily on him. But then he found the journal, tucked away in a hidden drawer of an old desk, its pages yellowed and brittle with age, the writing within detailed dark, ancient rituals, things that sent shivers down his spine. What had his relative been involved in? And why had he, of all people, been chosen to inherit this cursed place? Before we dive deeper into Adrian's unraveling nightmare, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. If you think you can handle more of these twisted tales, tap that notification bell and let's explore the darkest corners of the unknown together. Adrian's first night in the mansion was a battle against the overwhelming silence that engulfed the house. The ticking of an ancient grandfather clock echoed through the hallways, its rhythm irregular, almost as if it were slowing down and speeding up at will. Exhausted, he finally drifted into a restless sleep, but it wasn't long before he found himself standing in the middle of the grand hall, shrouded in an unnatural darkness. The moonlight filtered in through the cracked windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. But something was wrong. The room didn't feel like it belonged to the present. Everything was too clean, too pristine, as if he had been transported back in time. The air was heavy with the scent of burning incense, thick and pungent, suffocating. In the distance, a low, guttural chanting began to rise, the words foreign, ancient, carrying a weight that sent chills down his spine. Adrian turned, trying to locate the source, but his feet felt as though they were stuck in mud, dragging with every step. The walls seemed to close in, the portraits of long-dead relatives glaring at him from their frames. Their eyes were following him, almost alive, almost aware. His heartbeat quickened, each breath more labored than the last. Then, without warning, he saw them, dark figures cloaked and hooded, standing at the edges of the room. Their faces were hidden, but their presence was overwhelming. They moved in unison, their cloaks whispering against the floor as they circled around him. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and Adrian could feel the pressure building in his chest, like something was trying to claw its way out of him. The figures raised their hands in the air, their fingers twisted and gnarled like the roots of an ancient tree, pointing towards him. A sudden, sharp sound pierced the air, like the crack of a whip, and Adrian's vision blurred, the world around him spiraling into darkness. But just before he was consumed, he woke up, gasping for breath. The room was cold, colder than it should have been, and his body was drenched in sweat. Yet the smell of burning incense still lingered, faint but undeniable, as if the dream hadn't entirely let go. His eyes darted around the room, heart pounding, but there was no one there. No hooded figures, no chanting, just silence. Trembling, he glanced at his wrist, where a strange, burning sensation had begun to throb. And there, etched into his skin, was a mark, a symbol he had never seen before, but one that filled him with an inexplicable dread. The following day, Adrian couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that clung to him. The mark on his wrist pulsed faintly, like a bruise that hadn't fully formed. He spent hours scouring the house for clues, hoping to find some rational explanation for what had happened. But the deeper he ventured into the mansion's decaying halls, the more it felt as though the house itself was alive, watching his every move. The air was stale and oppressive, thick with the scent of mildew and something more, something faintly metallic, like blood long dried but never fully washed away. The whispers began soon after, soft at first, like a distant conversation barely audible, but growing louder with each passing minute. It wasn't just his imagination. Every creak of the floor, every groan of the ancient wooden beams felt deliberate, as though the house was speaking to him, warning him. He brushed his hand along the banister of the grand staircase, feeling the smooth, cold wood beneath his fingers. It was then that he noticed the figures again, shadows, just at the edge of his vision, flickering like dying flames. They would disappear the moment he turned his head, but he could sense their presence, lingering, watching. That night, the dream returned, but this time, the boundaries between dream and reality blurred even further. Adrian was no longer just a passive observer. He was part of the ritual. The same dark, hooded figures surrounded him, their faces hidden behind deep hoods. But now, he could feel their eyes boring into him, their silent judgment weighing heavily on his soul. The chanting was louder, more menacing, and the words seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of his bones. His breath quickened as the room seemed to close in on him, the walls stretching, contorting, as though the house itself was trying to swallow him whole. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted, and Adrian found himself standing before an altar, its surface slick with something dark and glistening. The mark on his wrist burned fiercely now, glowing with an eerie light that illuminated the faces of the figures around him. Their expressions were still obscured, but their intentions were clear. They wanted him. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and the air became thick with the smell of burning flesh. He could feel their hands reaching for him, cold and clammy, pulling him closer to the altar. His skin crawled, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to move. He was trapped, paralyzed by fear and the overwhelming sense that this was not just a dream. It was a memory, a past he didn't know he had lived. Just as the hooded figures closed in, their breath hot against his skin, the scene shifted abruptly. Adrian was back in his bedroom, gasping for air, but the smell of burning incense still lingered, thick and suffocating. His chest heaved with each breath, and his hand instinctively went to his wrist. The mark was still there, now more vivid, more real. The house was no longer just a structure of wood and stone. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was hungry. Something ancient and malevolent was stirring within its walls, and it had chosen Adrian as its next victim. The fourth night brought no reprieve. Adrian had tried everything to escape the growing horror, researching the house's history, trying to leave, even considering burning the place down. But every time he approached the door, something would stop him. A shadow darting in the corner of his eye, an invisible force pressing him back. The house had become a prison, one with no visible walls, but an undeniable grip. That night, as he lay in bed, fighting the overwhelming urge to sleep, he felt the mark on his wrist pulse, sending sharp waves of pain through his arm. His body was no longer his own, dragged into the abyss of the dream against his will. This time, there was no transition, no gradual descent into the dream world. One moment, Adrian was in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, and the next, he was standing in the cold, damp basement of the mansion. The walls around him dripped with moisture, the stones ancient and worn, covered in symbols that seemed to shift and twist in the dim light. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the distant chanting had returned, louder than ever before. The hooded figures materialized once again, their presence now undeniable, solid, real. They moved slowly, deliberately, surrounding him in a circle as the chanting reached a fevered pitch. At the center of the room stood the altar, cold, rough stone slick with dark stains that Adrian now realized were fresh. His stomach churned as the metallic scent of blood filled his nostrils, more potent than ever. The mark on his wrist began to glow, its light matching the strange symbols carved into the walls, linking him to the ritual in a way that was terrifyingly clear. His vision blurred, but through the haze, he could see something. No, someone lying on the altar. As he stepped closer, dread filled his chest like ice. It was him. Adrian's own lifeless body lay on the stone, eyes open and vacant, blood trickling from his wrists and pooling on the floor. The hooded figures chanted louder, the words now clear. He returns, the blood will bind, the night eternal. His head spun, and he felt the room closing in, but there was no escape. The hooded figures reached out, their cold, skeletal hands gripping his arms, pulling him towards the altar. He tried to scream, to break free, but his voice was gone, swallowed by the deafening chants that filled the air. The closer he got to his own corpse, the more his body felt disconnected, as if he was losing his grip on reality. And then, in a moment of gut-wrenching terror, the corpse on the altar moved. Its head turned slowly, its dead eyes locking onto Adrian's. The body smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin that stretched too wide, as though something far darker and older was wearing his skin. The hooded figures began to lower him onto the altar, their voices now a fevered, manic chorus of ancient words. Adrian's mind reeled, the realization hitting him like a freight train. He wasn't dreaming. This was real. The ritual, the blood, the symbols, they were all real, and he was its final sacrifice. Just as the cold stone touched his back, everything stopped. The chanting, the movement, the air itself seemed to freeze in place. For a moment, there was silence. Thick, oppressive silence. Then, without warning, Adrian was yanked out of the basement and thrust back into his bed, gasping for breath. His chest heaved, his heart pounded, and sweat poured down his face. But the smell of blood, the icy touch of those hands, they were still there, clinging to him like a second skin. The mark on his wrist was burning now, glowing faintly in the dark room. Adrian's hands shook as he reached for the bedside lamp. As the light flickered on, his eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign that it had all just been a nightmare. But then his gaze fell on the floor, and his blood ran cold. There, near the foot of the bed, were muddy footprints leading from the door to his bed. They weren't his. Someone or something had been in the room with him. The line between dream and reality had been shattered, and whatever force was haunting him had found its way into the waking world. The terror wasn't confined to the house's history. It was now a part of him. The next morning, Adrian woke with a sense of dread so profound it felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. The memory of the previous night lingered in his mind, but now it wasn't just a dream. The muddy footprints at the foot of his bed were real. Someone, or something, had crossed into his world. As he stumbled out of bed, his mind raced. He couldn't stay in the house any longer, but he knew leaving wasn't an option. The house had a hold on him, one he couldn't explain but could feel tightening with every passing hour. Determined to understand the nightmare he was trapped in, he set out to uncover the truth. Adrian returned to the study, the dim morning light casting long shadows across the dusty room. He rummaged through the old books and journals left by his distant relative, flipping through pages of cryptic writings and unsettling sketches. The more he read, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. His ancestor hadn't simply lived in a mansion. They had been the high priest of a secret cult called the Night Eternal. The cult believed that through ancient blood rituals, they could achieve immortality by binding themselves to the descendants of their original founders. Adrian was one of those descendants, chosen to be the vessel through which the cult's power would be reborn. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he read descriptions of rituals eerily similar to the visions he'd been experiencing. The mark on his wrist wasn't just a symbol. It was a key, a seal that bound him to the Night Eternal. The dreams weren't dreams at all. They were memories, echoes of the past, pulling him into the same fate his ancestors had tried to escape. The hooded figures weren't figments of his imagination. They were real, waiting for the right moment to complete the ritual. The house was alive with their presence. Their whispers carried through the walls like a sinister lullaby. Adrian's hands trembled as he turned the final page of the journal. There, in faded ink, was a detailed account of the last known ritual, one that had failed. His ancestor had tried to break the curse by fleeing the mansion, but they had been hunted down, dragged back, and sacrificed to ensure the cult's survival. Adrian's stomach turned as he realized the same fate awaited him. The visions of his own body on the altar weren't just nightmares. They were a prophecy, a glimpse into the future the night eternal had planned for him. Desperation clawed at his mind. Adrian scoured the house for more clues, something, anything, that could help him escape this nightmare. In the basement, hidden behind a false wall, he discovered a small chamber, its stone floor stained with dried blood. On the far wall, an altar was carved into the rock, the same altar from his dreams. It was real, every detail burned into his memory. Above it, inscribed in ancient runes, was a chilling message: "The blood will bind, the night eternal." Suddenly, everything became clear. The figures in the hooded cloaks had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Adrian to return to the mansion, to claim what was rightfully his. His bloodline had brought him back, but it wasn't just about inheritance. He was the key to completing the ritual, the missing piece that would unlock the cult's return. As he stood in that dark, suffocating chamber, the air thick with the smell of earth and decay, Adrian felt the walls closing in on him. The cult was not dead. It had merely been sleeping, waiting for its moment to rise again. But what terrified him most was the growing realization that he wasn't alone. The house wasn't empty, and the cult's influence wasn't confined to the past. It was here, now, woven into the very fabric of the mansion, watching, waiting. Adrian's every move felt monitored. Every breath, he took a struggle against the oppressive weight of the house's dark history. He knew the cult was coming for him, that the final ritual would be performed whether he liked it or not. And this time, there would be no escape. With growing dread, Adrian realized that his dreams had been more than just warnings. They were instructions, guiding him toward a destiny he couldn't avoid. The boundaries between dream and reality had been shattered, and the cult's power was leaking into the real world, pulling him closer to his inevitable fate. He had to act quickly, but time was running out, and the mark on his wrist continued to pulse, a constant reminder that his connection to the night eternal was growing stronger. The question now was not whether he could escape, but whether he could survive long enough to try. As the days passed, Adrian became consumed by his need to understand the dark forces that had taken root in his life. He stopped sleeping, terrified of what waited for him in the dream world. His appearance deteriorated, his eyes hollow and bloodshot, his hands shaking as he flipped through the ancient journals, desperately seeking answers. The house itself seemed to change around him. Doors that had once been locked swung open on their own, hallways stretched unnaturally long, and shadows crawled along the walls like living things. Every creak, every whisper felt like a taunt, a reminder that time was running out. Desperation gnawed at his mind, and Adrian knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help. Venturing into the nearby village, he sought out an expert, someone who could make sense of the cult's cryptic writings. His search led him to Evelyn Clark, an eccentric historian known for her research into occult practices. When Adrian showed her the journals, her face paled. She recognized the symbol on his wrist immediately. It was the mark of a blood covenant, a binding contract between him and the ancient cult. "You're connected to them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The Night Eternal. It's not just a cult. They're a conduit for something far older, far darker." Evelyn explained that the Night Eternal had been active centuries ago, performing rituals to summon entities from beyond the veil of reality. These entities, ancient and malevolent, had granted the cult members power in exchange for blood, specifically, the blood of their descendants. Adrian was one of those descendants, bound to the cult through his bloodline, and the mark on his wrist was a beacon, drawing the entities closer to him. Every ritual, every dream was part of a larger plan to open the gateway between worlds, allowing the night eternal to rise again and unleash the horrors they worshipped. The weight of her words hit Adrian like a hammer. The cult wasn't just trying to kill him. They were trying to use him to bring something far worse into the world. His blood was the key to unlocking that door. Panic set in, and he demanded to know how to stop it, how to break the connection. But Evelyn's expression turned grim. "There's no easy way out," she said. "Once you're marked, it's nearly impossible to sever the bond. You'd have to confront them directly. Stop the ritual before it's completed. But if you fail..." Her voice trailed off, and Adrian didn't need her to finish the sentence. If he failed, the cult wouldn't just kill him. They'd take his soul, trapping him in their eternal nightmare. Back at the mansion, the air had grown colder. The once faint whispers now a constant murmur, barely distinguishable from the howling wind outside. Adrian could feel the presence of the hooded figures more strongly now, as though they were lurking just beyond the edges of his vision. Every time he turned a corner, he expected to see them standing there, waiting, their hollow eyes fixed on him. The mark on his wrist had darkened, the skin around it inflamed and throbbing with pain. He knew the ritual was nearing completion. The cult was growing stronger, and soon they would make their final move. Driven by fear and anger, Adrian began tearing through the mansion's remaining rooms, searching for the ritual chamber. His every step felt heavier, as if the house itself was fighting against him, trying to keep him from finding the truth. Strange things began happening. The paintings on the walls seemed to shift when he wasn't looking, their eyes following him with unsettling intensity. Objects moved on their own, chairs scraping across the floor, doors slamming shut with deafening force. And then, the voices. The voices were no longer distant. They were right next to him, whispering his name, beckoning him to give in, to join them. As the tension mounted, Adrian discovered a hidden passageway behind one of the walls in the grand hall. It led deep into the earth, the air growing colder and more suffocating with each step. The walls of the passage were lined with strange symbols, the same ones he'd seen in his dreams, glowing faintly in the dark. At the end of the tunnel, he found it, the ritual chamber, just as he had seen it in his visions. The altar stood in the center, its surface slick with blood, and around it were the hooded figures, waiting silently. They didn't move, didn't speak, but Adrian could feel their eyes on him, boring into his soul. The mark on his wrist burned white-hot now, as if it were alive, pulsing in time with the rhythm of the ancient symbols carved into the walls. He knew what came next. The cult would finish the ritual, and he would be their final offering. But there was something else, something deeper, gnawing at the edges of his mind. A choice. The ritual couldn't be completed without his consent. The cult needed him to surrender, to accept his place in their dark legacy. And as the weight of the decision pressed down on him, Adrian realized that the battle wasn't just against the cult, it was against himself. The air in the ritual chamber was thick with a palpable darkness, pressing in on Adrian like an invisible force. The hooded figures stood in eerie silence, their faces hidden in the deep shadows of their cloaks. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic pulse of the mark on his wrist, beating in sync with the strange symbols carved into the stone walls. It was as if the mansion itself had come alive, its ancient, malevolent heart finally revealed. Adrian could feel it in his bones. Something was about to happen, something terrible. The ritual was reaching its climax, and there was no turning back. Suddenly, the hooded figures began to chant, their voices low and guttural, reverberating through the chamber. The symbols on the walls started to glow brighter, casting an eerie red light that bathed the room in a hellish hue. Adrian's pulse quickened as the pressure in the air grew heavier, almost suffocating. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears like a war drum. The mark on his wrist burned with searing intensity, as if it was trying to consume him from the inside. He knew the moment was coming, the moment when the choice would have to be made. In the center of the room, the altar stood cold and menacing, slick with the blood of countless victims. And there, on the altar, was a sight that sent a chill down Adrian's spine. His own reflection. It wasn't just a vision. It was his body, bound and lifeless, just as he had seen in his dreams. The hooded figures had already prepared the sacrifice, and all that was left was for Adrian to complete the ritual. But it wasn't just his body that was at stake. It was his soul. The cult had chosen him, bound him through his bloodline, and now they were ready to claim him. The final sacrifice, the key to opening the gateway between worlds. But there was something else, something more insidious. As Adrian stared at his own reflection, the truth began to unravel. The cult wasn't just after his life. They wanted him to join them, to willingly become part of their eternal legacy. The mark on his wrist was more than a brand. It was a contract, a binding agreement that could only be completed with his consent. The hooded figures stopped chanting, their silence heavier than their words had ever been. They stood motionless, waiting for Adrian to make his choice. He felt the weight of it crushing down on him. If he refused, the cult would still try to claim him, but without his consent, their power would remain incomplete. He could feel the darkness gnawing at the edges of his mind, tempting him with promises of power, of immortality. The voices that had once been distant whispers were now right next to his ear, urging him to give in, to accept his fate. He could end the torment, stop the nightmares, and become something greater, something eternal. But deep down, Adrian knew the truth. The power they offered wasn't freedom. It was a prison, a trap that would consume him forever. In a moment of clarity, Adrian realized what he had to do. The cult needed him to surrender, to willingly give himself over to them. And that was their weakness. As long as he resisted, they couldn't complete the ritual. But the price of resistance was high. The figures began to move toward him, their hands reaching out, cold and skeletal, their faces still hidden beneath their hoods. Adrian's heart raced as he backed away, but there was nowhere to run. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening with every step. The chanting resumed, louder this time, more insistent. The mark on his wrist pulsed violently, sending waves of pain up his arm. Adrian's vision blurred as the pressure in the room mounted, the walls themselves vibrating with the force of the ritual. His legs felt weak, his body trembling under the weight of the impending choice. And then, in one terrifying moment, everything stopped. The air went still, the chanting ceased, and the room was plunged into an unnatural silence. One of the hooded figures stepped forward, lowering their hood to reveal a face that Adrian instantly recognized. It was his own. His doppelganger stared back at him with cold, empty eyes, a twisted smile curling at the edges of its lips. "It's time," the figure whispered, its voice a perfect echo of Adrian's own. "Join us, and you will never have to fear again. Resist, and you will suffer for eternity." Adrian's mind raced, but he knew there was only one way out. With every ounce of strength left in him, he grabbed the nearest object, a sharp piece of broken stone from the altar, and slashed it across his wrist, cutting deep into the mark. Blood poured from the wound, and the room erupted in chaos. The hooded figures screamed, their voices distorted and otherworldly, as the symbols on the walls flared with a blinding light. The ground beneath Adrian's feet shook violently, and the walls began to crack, splitting open like the earth itself was tearing apart. The altar shattered, and the doppelganger shrieked in rage, its form dissolving into a mass of swirling shadows. The house was collapsing, the very foundation of the cult's power crumbling under the force of Adrian's defiance. But as the chamber fell apart, Adrian felt something shift within him. The mark on his wrist, though severed, still pulsed faintly, a reminder that the connection had not been fully broken. The cult was gone, but the darkness they had unleashed still lingered, waiting, watching. Adrian had survived the ritual, but at what cost? The voices, though distant now, still whispered in the back of his mind, promising that this wasn't the end. And as he stumbled out of the crumbling mansion, the cold night air biting at his skin, Adrian knew the terrifying truth. The battle wasn't over. The cult had been defeated, but the mark remained. The night eternal would return, and next time, they wouldn't give him a choice. Adrian stood outside the crumbling mansion, the cold night air biting at his skin, but the chill that ran down his spine wasn't from the temperature. It was the lingering dread that clung to him. The house, once imposing and suffocating with its ancient secrets, was now reduced to rubble. The cult of the night eternal was no more, but the mark on his wrist throbbed faintly, a haunting reminder that the darkness had not been fully banished. He stared at the ruins, feeling an odd mix of relief and fear. The battle was over, but was it truly? As the wind whispered through the trees, Adrian could still hear the faint echoes of the hooded figure's chants, like a distant memory that refused to fade. His mind raced, replaying the final moments in the ritual chamber, the confrontation with his doppelganger, the shattering of the altar, the disintegration of the cult members. Yet, deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unfinished. The mark on his wrist hadn't fully disappeared, and even now, it pulsed softly, as if it were alive, waiting for something. It was a connection that he couldn't sever, no matter how much he tried. The night sky above him seemed darker than before, the stars hidden behind thick clouds that rolled in like a warning. Adrian's breath came in shallow gasps, and he realized the truth that gnawed at the edges of his mind. The night eternal wasn't gone. It was dormant, biding its time, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The cult may have crumbled, but the entity they served, the malevolent force lurking beyond the veil of reality, was still out there. And Adrian, marked by his bloodline, was forever linked to it. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the nearby trees, but there was something unsettling about the way they moved, like unseen figures shifting in the darkness, watching, waiting. Every shadow seemed deeper, more menacing, as though the world itself had been tainted by the events that had transpired in the mansion. Adrian's senses were heightened, his skin prickling with the feeling of being observed. He glanced down at his wrist, half expecting to see the mark glowing again, but remained faint, a dull ache beneath the surface of his skin. He knew, however, that it wasn't over. Adrian turned his back on the ruins, walking away with heavy steps, but the weight of the house's history followed him. Every crunch of gravel underfoot, every gust of wind felt like a reminder that the darkness wasn't truly gone. It had seeped into his life, into his very soul, and no matter how far he ran, it would follow. The night eternal had chosen him, and while he had resisted their pull this time, he couldn't help but wonder. What if they returned? What if the ritual wasn't fully stopped? Would they come for him again? As he reached the edge of the property, Adrian paused, glancing back one last time at the silhouette of mansion, now barely visible in the distance. A part of him felt drawn to it, as if the house still had more secrets to reveal. But he couldn't go back. Not now. Not ever. The memories of the hooded figures, the cold touch of their skeletal hands, and the twisted smile of his doppelganger haunted him, replaying in his mind like a cursed loop. The wind carried a faint whisper, almost like a voice, calling his name. Adrian shuddered, quickening his pace as he left the grounds. But as he walked, something gnawed at him. What if the cult had planned for this? What if the ritual had only been the beginning? The mark on his wrist felt heavier now, a constant reminder that the connection between him and the night eternal was still there. They had chosen him for a reason, and though he had stopped them once, he couldn't shake the feeling that they would try again. Perhaps next time they wouldn't need his consent. Perhaps next time they would simply take him. Adrian's thoughts spiraled, a mix of fear and uncertainty flooding his mind. He could feel the thin veil between the world of the living and the ancient forces the cult worshipped. It was still fragile, and the line between dream and reality had blurred too many times for him to feel safe again. Would the night eternal stop at nothing to complete their ritual? Were they waiting for him to let his guard down? Or worse, were they already here, hiding in the shadows, watching his every move? As Adrian disappeared into the night, the lingering questions weighed on him. Could he ever truly escape the cult's grasp? Would the mark ever fade, or was it a permanent scar on his soul? And most terrifying of all, was the night eternal still watching him, biding their time for the perfect moment to strike again? What do you think? Is Adrian free from the cult, or has his battle only just begun? The night eternal may be dormant for now, but darkness has a way of returning when you least expect it. Share your theories in the comments, and let us know what you think really happened. Could the cult still be out there, waiting for their next victim? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of the unknown, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next chapter. The night is far from over.